A black man is wrongfully arrested until his identity is revealed, leaving the officers in shock. Before the story begins, if you like our channel, subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. And now, we invite you to enjoy a story with an unexpected ending. Johnson was a man who went unnoticed by most. Tall, with well-groomed graying hair and eyes etched with stories few would ever know, he was the picture of calm. That morning, he dressed simply. A light blue dress shirt, jeans, and worn but clean shoes. He carried an old leather briefcase, the kind you'd imagine held more than just papers, maybe principles, maybe secrets. The bakery's coffee was a staple of Johnson's routine. He loved to watch people while savoring his toasted bread and reading the local paper. That place was his haven, where he felt the pulse of the city. It was a modest neighborhood, bustling with early risers, kids running to catch school buses, and animated chatter about everyday life. Johnson cherished these moments because in his line of work, it was easy to lose touch with the simplicity of ordinary life. Johnson was a federal judge, but he wasn't the kind of man who announced it. He believed true power lay in humility and empathy, not in titles. He'd learned early on that justice was about more than enforcing laws. It was about understanding people, their struggles, and their stories. But that morning, there was something different in his demeanor. A silent tension lingered, almost imperceptible. To anyone who didn't know him well, he was at the center of something big. A confidential investigation he had been leading for months was about to reach a critical point, and as always, Johnson bore the weight alone. As he took a sip of his coffee, he caught a glimpse of something unusual in the bakery's glass window. A convoy of police vehicles speeding toward the shop. Sirens cut through the usual morning sounds, drawing curious glances from the customers. Johnson felt a chill run down his spine. He'd seen scenes like this before, but this time, the focus seemed to be on him. Before he could react, two armed officers entered the bakery. All eyes turned to them. One of the officers, stocky with an authoritative air, looked directly at Johnson. "Johnson?" the man asked, his voice firm and emotionless. Johnson nodded calmly and rose without resistance. He knew something was wrong, but he showed no fear. "You're under arrest on suspicion of involvement in a robbery that occurred last night," the officer said. Murmurs spread through the bakery. "Johnson? Arrested? That must be a mistake," someone whispered. Johnson was known as a fair and polite man, yet, before he could explain, the officers handcuffed him right there in front of everyone. Johnson kept his gaze steady and composed, but inside something burned. He knew his arrest wasn't just a bureaucratic error. There was something much bigger at play. As he was escorted to the police car, he saw the looks of judgment and surprise on the faces around him. Some snapped pictures on their phones, others whispered, shaking their heads. Inside the patrol car, the weight of injustice grew, but Johnson kept his emotions in check. He was a man trained to think before acting. He observed every move the officers made, every word they said. They seemed overly tense, as if carrying out rushed orders. At the station, he was met with cold indifference. No one seemed interested in hearing his side or checking his identification. He was thrown into a cramped cell surrounded by grimy walls and the smell of mildew. Sitting on the concrete bench, Johnson closed his eyes for a moment. He knew this wasn't just an arrest. It was a warning. Someone was trying to silence him. Outside, the city carried on with its usual frantic pace. But for Johnson, the tranquility of that morning had shattered. He was now at the heart of a battle far bigger than he'd imagined. Even behind bars, his mind was already working on how to turn the situation around. He knew the truth came at a cost, and he was ready to pay it. In the cold, cramped cell, Johnson sat with his back straight, staring intently at the floor. He was a man accustomed to pressure, but this moment was different. The injustice cut deeper than just an attack on him as an individual. It struck at his core as a defender of the law. He knew there was something much bigger at play. What he didn't yet know was just how far his enemies were willing to go to silence him. Shortly after being placed in the cell, two officers walked down the narrow corridor. One of them, the same officer who had cuffed him at the bakery, stopped in front of the bars. He crossed his arms, flashing a smug grin. "So, Judge, enjoying the accommodations? You might want to get used to it because you're going to be here for a while," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Johnson slowly raised his eyes to meet the officer's gaze, his expression calm but firm. He didn't reply. He knew that in situations like this, every word could be turned against him. "No words, huh?" the officer continued, tapping his baton against the bars. "You might be someone important in the courtroom, but in here, you're just another guy." The other inmates watched in silence, some with curious looks, others with pity. Johnson took a deep breath. He knew he had to stay composed. The system he had dedicated his life to protecting was now being weaponized against him. But that wouldn't make him give up. Hours passed. Outside, the constant ringing of phones and muffled conversations in the precinct created an atmosphere of relentless tension. Johnson, however, observed everything. His sharp eyes picked up on the small details. He noticed how the officers avoided making eye contact with him, as if they were hiding something. When two of them spoke in hushed tones near his cell, he listened carefully. "The boss wants this done quickly. We don't want the press involved," one of them said, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "And what do we do with him? We can't keep him here for long. He'll figure it out," the other replied. Johnson closed his eyes for a moment, piecing things together. They were desperate. The order to arrest him wasn't just a scare tactic, it was part of a larger plan. He wasn't just a target, he was a threat. Later, a young guard, seemingly new to the job, was tasked with delivering food to Johnson. The rookie, visibly uneasy, avoided, making eye contact as he placed the tray on the floor of the cell. "You're new here, aren't you?" Johnson asked, his voice calm yet firm. The young man hesitated but eventually answered, still not looking directly at him. "Yes, sir, I am." "And how do you feel about working for a system that imprisons innocent men?" Johnson pressed, his tone devoid of anger, but heavy with meaning. The rookie looked at him, startled. There was no malice in the question, only truth. He tried to respond, but a senior officer appeared in the hallway, interrupting him. "Don't talk to the inmates!" the superior barked, pulling the young man away by the arm. Johnson noted that the rookie might be a weak link in the wall of corruption. He didn't seem comfortable with what was happening, and more importantly, he didn't appear fully loyal to those who had orchestrated Johnson's arrest. It was a potential opening Johnson could use. As night fell, Johnson reflected on the recent events. The investigation he had been leading for months involved a deep web of corruption, ranging from small-scale extortion to influence peddling among high-ranking local police officials. He had known he was dealing with dangerous people, but he hadn't expected them to be bold enough to arrest him. That meant he was close to uncovering something significant, something that scared them. In the adjacent cell, an older man with white hair and a weary expression watched Johnson. After a few minutes of silence, the man spoke. "You don't look like someone who belongs here." Johnson glanced at him, hesitating before replying, "And who does belong here, in your opinion?" The man gave a bitter smile. "People like me. People who've done bad things. You seem like someone who believes in what's right." Johnson pondered the man's words. He did believe in what was right, but sitting in that cell, he felt the weight of all the times he had seen the system fail. He knew he was at a disadvantage, but he also knew that truth was his greatest weapon. In the distance, he heard a heated argument among the officers. Straining to listen, he caught fragments of their words: press, witness, and judge. Johnson took a deep breath. He could feel the situation escalating, but he knew it wasn't time to act impulsively. He needed more information. He needed allies, and the young officer might be the missing piece of the puzzle. For now he waited, fully aware that his patience and intellect would be tested to their limits. In that cell, humiliated and treated like a criminal, Johnson didn't feel fear. He felt determination. He wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been crushed by the same system he had sworn to uphold. And he knew this battle was only beginning. The early hours of the morning brought an unsettling silence to the precinct. Johnson, seated in his cell with his back against the wall, was far from sleep. His mind worked tirelessly, analyzing every detail that had led him there. He knew he wasn't dealing with a mere procedural mistake. This was a deliberate operation, meticulously designed to discredit him and remove him from the investigation. Across the corridor, the officers began to relax, assuming Johnson's arrest had gone unnoticed. They underestimated the judge's sharp perception, as he remained attuned to every conversation and movement. He understood that true power lay not in physical strength, but in intelligence and patience. In the adjacent room, muffled voices broke through the quiet. Two officers were talking, believing no one could hear them. Johnson discreetly moved closer to the bars and tilted his head, catching critical fragments of their conversation. "This won't hold for long," a man's worried voice said. "He's a federal judge, not some nobody. If anyone finds out, we're screwed." "That's why we need to wrap this up quickly," the other replied firmly. "The boss wants everything handled before the press or the courts catch wind of it." Johnson felt a chill run through him, but only for a moment. He had already suspected there was more behind his arrest, and now he had confirmation. The boss. Who could it be? One name echoed in his mind, someone he had been investigating. Chief Rocha, a powerful man with a suspicious history of sudden wealth and buried accusations. As dawn broke, the young rookie officer Johnson had observed the previous night returned to the cell with breakfast. The young man looked nervous but also curious. Johnson knew he had to tread carefully to earn the officer's trust. "Good morning, son," Johnson said in a calm, steady tone. "Working in a tough place, aren't you?" The rookie hesitated, glancing around before responding. "I'm just doing my job, sir." "Does your job include arresting innocent men?" Johnson asked, his voice still calm but his gaze unwavering. The officer visibly squirmed, avoiding eye contact. I don't know what you're talking about. I just do what I'm told." Sensing the hesitation, Johnson pressed on, his words cutting deep without aggression. "You know something's wrong. You might not know all the details, but you feel it, don't you? You have a choice, son. You can ignore it and become like them, or you can do what's right." The rookie lowered his head, but before he could reply, a senior officer stormed into the corridor, glaring at him. "What are you doing here? I told you not to talk to the prisoners. Leave the food and go." The rookie obeyed, but not before exchanging a quick, meaningful glance with Johnson. It was a sign. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was willing to help. As Johnson waited for his next opportunity, an unexpected event occurred. A man was brought into the neighboring cell, handcuffed and visibly irritated. He appeared middle-aged, with a face weathered by time and a demeanor that suggested he'd fought many battles in his life. Once the guards left, he turned to Johnson. "You're the judge, aren't you?" the man asked in a low voice. Johnson looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected anyone there to recognize him. "And who are you?" "Someone who knows this dirty system all too well," the man replied. "I heard what happened. You've stirred up trouble with powerful people who don't want the truth coming out." Johnson stayed silent, but his eyes spoke volumes. The man continued. "I work as a driver for a security company. I've heard plenty while sitting in those cars. These cops, Chief, Rocha, they're all in the pocket of a businessman named Alvaro Martins. They're using the precinct to cover up their dirty dealings, and you're in their way." The confirmation hit Johnson like a blow, but he maintained his composure. Alvaro Martins was precisely the man he had been investigating for months, an entrepreneur deeply involved in money laundering, influence peddling, and bribes that tainted the entire system. "Why are you telling me this?" Johnson asked, wary. "Because I've already lost everything to this system. My wife, my home, all because I refuse to play their game. If I can help someone bring them down, I'll do it." Johnson nodded slowly. He had one more piece of the puzzle. Now, he needed to act. Later that afternoon, the rookie officer returned, this time with a more determined expression. He brought a bottle of water, and as he handed it to Johnson, slipped him a folded note. Johnson took it discreetly and waited for the right moment to open it. The note was short but clear. "If you need help, I'll be on duty tonight. Don't trust anyone else. I have access to the system. Josh. A spark of hope ignited in Johnson. He knew he had to move quickly and strategically. Using the knowledge he had accumulated over years as a judge, he began formulating a plan to turn the tide. He needed concrete evidence, something that would expose not only the corrupt officers, but the entire operation behind them. As the day progressed, Johnson kept watching and listening. Every detail, every conversation could be the key to his freedom and to justice. He understood the battle ahead would be long, but he was ready to face it. Johnson wasn't just a man wrongfully imprisoned. He was a symbol of the fight against corruption. Even in that cell, he knew the truth was on his side, and when the truth is on the right side, it's only a matter of time before it prevails. Nightfall brought an eerie silence to the precinct, the kind that hinted at an impending storm. In his cell, Johnson waited. The water bottle containing the note from young Officer Josh sat beside him. He knew this night would be pivotal. As he observed the empty corridor, Johnson mentally rehearsed the plan he had pieced together since his arrest. He needed to act with precision, relying on the scant resources at his disposal, his knowledge of the law, his keen observation skills, and the small group of allies forming around him. Josh was the linchpin, but the driver in the adjacent cell could also play a role. Around midnight, the precinct grew quieter. Most of the officers had left, leaving only a skeleton crew on duty. Josh was among them. The young officer appeared in the corridor, carrying a flashlight and a stack of papers, pretending to be on a routine patrol. As he approached Johnson's cell, he whispered, "The records room is empty. The camera system is down for maintenance. This is our chance." Johnson nodded. He knew this was an opportunity he couldn't afford to miss. Josh carefully unlocked the cell, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was watching. Johnson stepped out silently, followed by the driver, who had also been freed. Josh handed Johnson an ID badge and a key. "This is for the records room. Inside, you'll find the evidence you need, audio recordings and documents incriminating Chief Rocha and his associates. But there's a problem," Josh said hesitantly. "What's the problem?" Johnson asked, his voice steady. "The door's secured with an electronic lock, and the code changes every 2 hours. I only have the current code. We need to move fast." The group moved through the corridors, Josh leading the way. Every step seemed too loud, every shadow a potential threat. Johnson knew time wasn't on their side. If they were caught, there wouldn't be a second chance. At the records room, Josh keyed in the code on the electronic lock. A soft click signaled that the door was open. They entered swiftly, and Johnson headed straight for the digital archives. He began navigating the files, his experience guiding him through the chaotic organization. After a few tense minutes, Johnson found what he was looking for: recordings of clandestine meetings, evidence of illegal financial transactions, and text messages between Chief Rocha and businessman Alvaro Martins. Each file was a crucial piece of the puzzle that could dismantle the corruption. As Johnson transferred the files to a flash drive provided by Josh, the driver kept watch at the door. "We need to hurry, they'll realize you're missing from the cell soon," the driver warned, glancing nervously down the corridor. Suddenly, voices echoed down the hallway. A group of officers was approaching. Josh's face turned pale. "They're not supposed to be here, something's wrong." Johnson finished the transfer, gripping the flash drive tightly. "We can't be caught now. This is everything we need to expose the truth." They hid behind a shelving unit as the officers entered the room. Johnson held his breath, listening to the heavy footsteps. One of the officers, seemingly suspicious, began inspecting the area. Josh signaled to Johnson to wait for the right moment to make their move. When the officers moved away slightly, Johnson gestured for the group to leave. They moved silently, but just as they reached the door, one officer spotted them. "Hey, stop right there!" the officer shouted. The group broke into a sprint, the sound of their footsteps, and the officer's shouts reverberating through the precinct. Josh led them to an emergency exit he knew was unlocked. They escaped into an alley behind the station, breathing heavily as they paused to catch their breath. Johnson looked at the flash drive in his hand. That small device held the power to change everything. "What now?" Josh asked, still trembling. "Now." "We take this to the press. The public needs to know the truth," Johnson replied. They made their way to a trusted contact of Johnson's investigative journalist Carla Johnson, renowned for her fearless reporting on corruption. As they handed her the flash drive, Johnson explained everything that had happened, from his arrest to the evidence they had uncovered. Carla promised to act swiftly. That very night, she began reviewing the files and preparing a bombshell exposé. Within hours, Chief Rocha was informed that the files had been leaked to the press. His fury was palpable as he realized the plan to silence Johnson had failed. Before he could react, Internal Affairs arrived at the precinct, accompanied by prosecutors and a federal task force. From a safe distance, Johnson and Carla watched as Chief Rocha was handcuffed in front of his team, along with other corrupt officers. The arrogance on his face was replaced by sheer panic. Carla's exposé aired that same night, detailing the corruption scheme and Johnson's wrongful imprisonment. The story spread like wildfire, sparking nationwide outrage. By morning, Johnson returned to the courthouse, greeted by applause from colleagues and the community. Josh, the young officer, received protection and a promotion for his bravery in exposing the truth. The driver, too, was given a second chance, with Johnson ensuring he had the support needed to rebuild his life. As Johnson walked through the city streets, many greeted him with respect and admiration. He knew the fight against corruption was far from over, but this was a significant victory. Before entering the courthouse, Johnson paused, looking toward the horizon. He understood that the battle for justice was relentless, but on this day, truth had prevailed. The morning after the operation that exposed the corruption scheme, the nation woke up different. The headlines in newspapers and news broadcasts were unanimous. Judge wrongfully imprisoned uncovers corruption scheme involving police chief and influential businessmen. Johnson's name was everywhere, but for him, it wasn't about fame or the spotlight. What drove him was the sense of duty fulfilled and the hope that this case might mark a turning point for the system he had spent his life trying to protect. Carla Johnson's detailed report, combined with the irrefutable evidence gathered by Johnson, sparked a wave of public outrage. Spontaneous protests erupted outside police stations and government buildings, demanding structural reform in public safety. Citizens who once felt powerless began to believe change was possible. Josh, the young officer who risked everything to help Johnson, became a symbol of hope. In a press conference organized by the Internal Affairs Division, he spoke about his decision to do what was right, despite threats and intimidation. His words moved millions. Every day as police officers, we make choices that determine whether we uphold justice or bow to corruption. For me, there was no choice but to fight for what's right. Judge Johnson showed me that courage and truth always find a way. Josh was promoted and transferred to a special investigations unit where he would continue his work, now inspired by Johnson's example. Later that week, Johnson returned to the courtroom. As he entered, he was met with applause from his colleagues and the community that had gathered to thank him for his bravery. He was surprised but deeply moved. Among those present was the driver he had helped free and his family, now with a renewed sense of hope after the case's exposure. However, Johnson knew his fight wasn't over. The corruption network he had dismantled was only one piece of a much larger system. He returned to work with renewed determination, not just to enforce the law, but to inspire meaningful change. The fallout from the case rippled through multiple levels. Chief Rocha and the corrupt officers were arrested and faced public trials, resulting in severe sentences. Alvaro Martins, the businessman funding the scheme, had his assets seized and became the target of a federal investigation that sent shockwaves through the upper echelons of power. With support from the press and the community, Johnson helped spark a national debate on the need for reforms in the police and judicial systems. New training programs were introduced to raise awareness among officers about ethics and accountability. Public pressure led to legislative changes that increased transparency in investigations. One afternoon, weeks after the case had closed, Johnson returned to the same bakery where it had all started. The setting was familiar, but something felt different. He ordered his usual coffee and toasted bread, but this time the people around him greeted him with smiles and words of gratitude. While sipping his coffee, a young woman approached him. She was a mother of 2 small children and spoke with heartfelt emotion. "Thank you for not giving up, Judge Johnson. Because of what you did, my daughter now believes justice is possible in this country." Johnson smiled, touched by her words, and replied, "Justice isn't a man or an institution. It's all of us who believe in what's right and refuse to accept what's wrong." As he left the bakery, Johnson looked up at the sky. The sun was shining, and the streets were full of life. He knew not all battles would be won so quickly, but the victory in this case proved something he had never doubted. The truth, no matter how hard it is to uncover, always finds a way. Johnson's story wasn't just about bringing down a corruption scheme. It was about the courage of an ordinary but extraordinary man who refused to accept injustice. It was about a young officer who chose to do the right thing, even when silence would have been easier. And it was about a community that found hope and strength amidst adversity. In the final moments of the news segment that concluded the case, Carla Johnson posed a question that resonated with everyone who had followed the story. And you? What would you do when faced with the choice between bowing to injustice or fighting for what's right? Perhaps the answer lies in Johnson's example and in all those who dare to believe justice can still prevail. Johnson's story came to an end, but the lesson remained. Change begins when someone decides they will no longer accept what is wrong. If this story moved you, if these events and reflections added something new to your journey, don't forget to share this video. Give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and help us share these stories and thoughts with even more people.